very good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate being here with us. Actually, although this is the last day of the forum, and also one of the last sessions, perhaps, especially because this is also the Friday afternoon, but you still come to our sessions. So we really appreciate it. My name is Yose Rizal Damuri, and in the next 1 hour and 15 minutes, I'm gonna lead the discussion in these sessions with the titles of Greening the Global Value Chain. This session actually is hosted by CSIS Indonesia, a Jakarta-based research institute, together with Think 20, a network of research institute and think tanks under G20. So this is basically a part of the Think 20 process that we have been doing for the whole year. And these sessions has a really generous support from 4 foundations that allow us to come to Geneva and also arrange the sessions. We in the next 1 hour, we would like to discuss about what we can do to make the global value chains become more sustainable and greener, while taking into account the contributions of the GVC actually to the economic development, particularly in the developing and emerging countries. So allow me to give some context of the discussions for this session. I think I don't need to emphasize the emergence of massive international production network and the global value chain have contributed a lot to global economic development and international trade. Particularly, GVCs can be seen as an important lever for developing and emerging economies to plug into global production and innovation ecosystems, just like what happens in East Asia and Southeast Asia. However, we also know that the GVC trades actually produce significant level of carbon emissions, which are then traded across border. It is estimated that trade emissions embedded in export amount to around 20% of global emissions, and some major part of it actually come from the GVC activities. Statistic from OECD shows, for example, that many economies serving as production hubs in the GVC tend to be the net exporters of carbon emissions, while market economies are largely the net importers of carbon emissions. So the actions actually needs to be taken at various levels, at firms, for example, or at company levels, lead firms and also the manufacturers need to take the production process in a low carbon manners. At national level, the governments, both host country government and also the market countries could provide incentive for greener production process. At global and also regional levels, some rules can take place to support the transformation, but also provide global common goods to promote the greener global value chain even further. So we are going to discuss various aspects to transform the GVC into low carbon process. Since this is also part of the Think 20 process and G20, we would also like to discuss how G20 can support such transformations. And we have here this afternoon 4 distinguished speakers that very well versed with trade policy and also global value chain, as well as very familiar with the G20 process. We have the lead speaker, Excellency Bapak Jerry Sambuaga. Selamat datang, Pak. Vice Minister of Trade of the Republic of Indonesia. who is also involved in directly in the trade, investment, and industry working group in the G20. The second speaker is Peter Draper from University of Adelaide, who is the leading academia on trade issues. I believe that you have 3 speaking engagement in this public forum alone, right, Peter? That indicates very vast knowledge on trade and trade policy issues. The third one is Pramila Crivelli from the ASEAN Development Bank, who has intensive studies on regional trade agreements. So I think you can enlighten us also the role of RTAs, Pramila, in supporting these transformations. Last but not least, we have with us Samir Saran from Observer Research Foundation India, who might be taking the discussions from the perspective of developing countries and G20 as well, as India will take up the role as a group presidency next year. Yeah. So to begin our discussions, let me invite Bapak Jerry Sambuaga to give some points that highlight the issues faced by developing countries and also related to the global value chains. Perhaps also you can highlight the do's and don'ts to transform global value chains into greener process. This, Pak Jerry, you have around 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Thank you, Pak Yose Rizal Damuri, the Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Jakarta, Indonesia. Also the honorable panelists, Professor Draper from the University of Adelaide, Dr. Pramila Crivelli from the ADB, and Dr. Samir Saran, the President of the Observer Research Foundation. And of course, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to everyone, and I'm here to talk about one of the themes that is given by Pak Yose, and we're going to be focusing on the greener global value chain, and of course from the Indonesian perspective, as we are holding the Indonesian presidency of G20 this year. And I think we have 10 minutes yet, Pak Yose. I'll try to be short. And here we have a little presentation of my slides. I'm not going to be elaborating on all slides, but let me focus on a couple of slides that I think is quite important for us to be discussing in this forum. First of all, about the outcomes and the results that we had in the G20 forum just a couple of weeks ago in Bali. Yeah. I think it has something to do with what we are doing right now and what the whole world is facing with, particularly on sustainability, on environment, and also on climate change, and as well as digitalization and all other aspects that are quite relevant to our developing world. Yeah. Not only developed countries, but also developing countries. First of all, I thank Pak Yose for the event, for the invitations, and also everyone here, so that we can probably share something that is quite useful and we can probably discuss on relevant or strategic matters that will be beneficial for all of us. And also honored to be here. It's a couple of times for me to be here. Always a pleasure. And let me start this moment by the latest update from the Trade, Industry, Investment Working Group that we had in Bali. So in this slide, you can see that one of the important matters that we produced was actually focusing on the collective economic recovery, which is will be divided into 6 priority issues. Yeah, the first is, of course, the WTO reform and the role of multilateral trade system to strengthen the achievement of sustainable development goals, and also the trade investment industry response to the pandemic, COVID-19, and global health architecture, digital trade, global value chain, and global economic recovery, and of course the industry 4.0. We believe that as given by our president, as it's mandated by our President Joko Widodo, that the theme of the presidency of G20 is recover together, recover strong. So the basic thing is how we collaborate as the interdependence is growing and increasing, as the whole world is now beginning to understand that we need to find immediate response, also collective measures, so that we can finally cope with all of the issues that we are facing right now. And we also notice that Sustainable Development Goals, quite interestingly linked to ongoing work at the WTO, which aims at promoting deeper international cooperation. So we are also aware of the existence of international organizations and also all other relevant stakeholders, that collaboration, not only collaboration, but collective and also objective cooperation and synergy are needed. And in this case, we're talking about a greener global value chain, Yose and ladies and gentlemen. We need to define and we need to understand and we need to make sure what the definition of green or let's say productive environmental, or let's say very wise or decision or very wise collective measure of how we are going to take on policies. So that's why I think it's very important for us to agree on terms and conditions on how sustainable development goals would be achieved, how green environment would be defined, and how this kind of things would be accomplished. So let me focus on the next slide. One of the important commitments from the G20 members raised on the question is that participation. We need to encourage participation among members, but not only among members, but the whole community, the whole world, as we are now facing the lack of, let's say, participation in some areas, in some developing countries, and in some range of minorities. So that's why small, medium enterprises, women, young entrepreneurs in global trade must be encouraged, like you said. And I think it is the duty of all of us here to encourage this kind of movement and of course the initiative made by all the relevant stakeholders in the G20 forum at the time. And I think it is also becoming important for all of us so that we can connect this with the global value chain, with the importance and relevance of global value chain. So how we can connect the participation in global value chain and also the characteristics of each country. Why? Because we need to understand first that one characteristic of country is not the same as the other characteristic of another country. Even among developing countries, I know we have Dr. Samir Saran. I think he will be delivering, I think, very good remarks about how India, as one of the developing countries, portraying and understanding and interpreting the importance of collectivity, of collaboration, and also of global value chain, seeing from the perspective of the developing country. I think we are beginning to understand and we have to observe that measure. So in this case, Yose and ladies and gentlemen, I think it is also important for us that if we want to talk about greener global value chain, we need to focus not only on the challenges that we are facing right now, but we have to focus on the definition of how the green global value chain should be measured. I will give you one example. Nowadays, we are discussing about carbon trading, green gas, house emission, and so on. But not only developed countries are facing this, the so-called crisis or situation, but also developing countries. Right? And the one who is actually giving valuation, the one who is actually giving measurement, the one who is actually giving observation about this should be involving a lot of participants. Now, in this case, I think we can also have discussion, maybe a more intensive discussion about how this measurement should be taking place. We have to not only focus, but also evaluate and also observe so that objectivity among measurements would be preserved well. So I think, in different regulations and different policies among countries. Okay, yes, I think it's fair to say that it's normal to say that every single country has different policies on that. But again, we need to find some sort of objectivity, a non-biased policy on how we define and how we measure green environmental, green global value chains. So I think think it's only 10 minutes. Are you saying?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I need to be short. I think we can have another discussion after this. But as my running out of time, I would like to close my remarks by saying thanks to Yose and all of the participants. And I think we all agree that having collectivity, cooperation is part of the requirements of part of the pre-obligations in order to prevail. And also India will be the next different presidency. Hope for the best of the best. And maybe a little information about Indonesia, how we close, before I close this session, this remark, I would like to say that Indonesia right now is in a very good path of sustaining international trade working collaboration. We've just concluded 26 trade agreements as for this year, and we are trying to expand more, trying to concentrate more on the non-traditional market. And during this pandemic COVID-19, we have achieved one of the highest surplus of our trade balance, with a number of quite significant. I think it surpasses the last year trade balance. Now is about $35.46 billion US dollar, and I think it's emerging, it's rising, and it's increasing. And we are certain that we're convinced and certain that by the end of this year, I think we will surpass not only the record of last year, but also among the ASEAN members. And as you know, that we are going to be leading the ASEAN community next year, summit. And also, I think we take it to the opportunity to again, deliver a message is quite essential and quite important for all of us to focus on collaboration, objectivity, and also fairness in how we define any single aspect, any single issue, any single challenge. One of them would be the global value change of this greener global value change concept. I think that's all that I would like to say. Thank you again, Pak Yose, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pak Jerry, for emphasizing the collectivity, collaborations, cooperations, and also objectivity. And perhaps the kind of objectivity can be looked at or can be found in the multilateral venue, rather than having a unilateral policy that each country or each economies try to set up in order to tackle the issues of environment, especially related to the global value chains. So thank you very much again. And I would like to follow up. I would like to ask Peter actually here that or have been following about trade issues for I think 4 years and already quite know a lot about the multilateral negotiations as well. Perhaps you can share with us the progress, what happens at the multilateral levels, especially on the issues related to the environment. We know that the environment is not really the main issues, especially during the Uruguay round or the WTO foundations in 1995, but currently it becomes very important. So how do you see the situations at the moment?
Well, thanks very much, Jose, and thanks to CSIS and the Indonesia T20 for inviting me to be on the panel. So I'll focus on the WTO as the multilateral. There's a lot going on in other multilateral forums such as the UNFCCC, CBD, and a plethora of other institutions. I think for the purposes of today's conversation, we're most interested in what's going on in the WTO. So a quick stock take would look roughly like this. So it's important to understand that there is a Committee on Trade and Environment in the WTO. That work continues and it's quite comprehensive in its scope as well as its depth. It is, of course, subject to the limitations of multilateral processes. And I think partly for that reason, we have other things going on. And I'll come to the TESSD process in particular shortly. But on the multilateral front, we've had a recent success, obviously, the interim fisheries subsidies agreement. And hopefully beyond that, we'll get a comprehensive fisheries subsidies agreement. And that's a very important achievement. So it's the first multilateral agreement really since, well, in essence, the Nairobi Ministerial and the agreement on export subsidies, but before that, the trade facilitation agreement. We also have the informal dialogue on plastics pollution. So that's a joint initiative led by the governments of China and Fiji. And that's addressing obviously a very pervasive global environmental problem in the form of plastics pollution, particularly of the oceans, but not only. We have another initiative on fossil fuel subsidies reform. This has actually been going for a long time in various multilateral organizations. And it's now found its way into the WTO conversation. And so what we're also finding is a convergence amongst these different processes and the so-called trade, environment, and sustainability structured dialogue, the TESSD process, which currently has 74 members participating in it. And it constitutes or is constituted by 4 pillars. And as the title suggests, it's a dialogue. It's not actually a formal negotiation process. So a bit like the Committee on Trade and Environment engages in technical deliberations, sharing of ideas and processes. So the 4 pillars cover environmental goods and services. I understand there's some difficulties in advancing that conversation, but at least there is a conversation on that front. The second pillar is called trade-related climate measures. So this would deal with things like the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which particularly the EU is in the forefront of, but other countries are starting to follow suit. And of course, that's raising issues about how things like carbon leakage will be dealt with by the multilateral trading system. Third pillar, which I have done a bit of work on, also done a bit of work on CBAMs, is the circular economy, so trade and the circular economy. That's, I think, a very interesting conversation about if and how WTO agreements enable or disable circular trade circular trade generally. So that's the third pillar, and then the fourth is on subsidies. So that's a fairly new one, but it brings into the conversation the fossil fuel subsidy reform initiative, as well as long-standing discussions about agriculture subsidies reform, where the particular focus on the potentially harmful environmental impacts of agricultural subsidies. Maybe a quick take on the TESSD process and how that's proceeding. So from what I've seen, I think it's an important, essentially plurilateral forum for incubating ideas and potential further reform initiatives in those 4 pillars. There's, I think, an open question as to how it will proceed going forward. So currently, it's a dialogue process across these 4 pillars, but at some point, presumably, issues might be ripe for negotiation, and then potentially a joint statement initiative or a plurilateral process might be initiated. Then what would happen to the pillar? Would it close down? I think there's some questions around that. Or will it just confine itself to more soft law approaches? So for instance, constructing reference papers like the old telecommunications reference paper and using those soft law approaches for essentially member states to take and inscribe into their own unilateral commitments. So that I think has yet to be decided, and it's relatively early days in the evolution of the TESSD process. Of course, if it does proceed, or maybe not if it does proceed, there is an open question, I would say, about how the TESSD process relates to the Committee on Trade and Environment. So the one is plurilateral, the other is multilateral, and I think these things remain to be seen. And then finally, just coming back to the theme, which is the global value chain context and how that relates to these ongoing processes, of which there are quite a few. So the WTO is pretty active in this trade and environment space. So that's good to see. But how does that connect to global value chains? I think it's pretty obvious that in all of these areas, global value chains are prevalent. But the degree of global in the value chain depends on the issue being covered. as well as its scope. So, for example, if one looks at the plastics dialogue, it's dealing with a very specific issue, which is plastics. It's an important value chain, but that's just one value chain. Contrast that to trade-related climate measures, which is potentially all-encompassing. If you think of what the CBAM is, for instance, as designed by the European Union. So currently that covers 5, I think, of the EU's emissions trading scheme sectors. That will expand to all 64 or so of the ETS sectors. That's many more value chains in the mix. It's potentially much more encompassing. But in all cases, I would say, whether you're talking about one value chain, plastics, or many value chains in the case of environmental goods and services, the central issues being dealt with from a trade point of view, so not so much the environment point of view, the trade point of view, are transactions costs. And so all of these initiatives will affect transactions costs in one way or another. Now, in some cases, they could be reduced. For example, in the environmental goods and services plurilateral, that's the intention, is to reduce transactions costs, also in the circular economy process. But in others, they could be increased. If one is thinking of a CBAM measure, for instance, the purpose there is to impose a tax at the border that is going to increase transactions costs. So it will affect global value chains in different ways. And then if we look at the subsidies reform conversations, again, it has a different set of implications for value chains. So if we're talking about reducing subsidies or getting rid of subsidies, then producers will be affected by that. Potentially some will go out of business, for example. But on the other hand, if we're talking about repurposing subsidies, as is the case in the agriculture negotiations, well, they might go somewhere else. And then that might favor new ventures, say green ventures. And of course, it's important finally to remember that business is not standing still in all of this. In fact, business is leading the charge in many ways. The WTO is following, that's typically the case. And so there are many new investments flowing into energy transition sectors that is reshaping value chains as we speak. And of course, there's private capital flowing out of what are seen to be stranded asset sectors. So coal, for example. In Australia, we talk about coal a lot because we're a major coal exporter, but that's an issue of concern for countries like Australia.
Thank you very much, Peter, for giving up updates to what happens at multilateral level, multilateral negotiations and discussions, and also how that impact the global value chains. I think that's that things have to be taken into account, especially for developing countries, since developing countries like Indonesia or many Southeast Asian and East Asian countries are very active in the global value chain, and that would influence, that would affect the value chains in those regions. Talking about regional, I would like to ask Pramila, who actually have been following regional trade agreements for some time and produced a lot of studies on that issue. First, I would like to ask how the regional trade agreements can also be a platform for trade-related, environment-related trade measures, and again, also how it affects the global value chains in general, especially considering that what we call a global value chain normally are regional value chains, such as the one that present in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Can you enlighten us about that, Pramila? Yes.
Thank you so much, Jose. Thank you for CSIS Indonesia 2020, to WTO for having me here today. It's really a pleasure, and I will try to answer your questions as best as I can. And to do that, I have prepared a few slides to support my talking points. And so I have to talk about the link between regional trade agreements and environment. So how regional trade agreements can really help reduce, address the climate change and environmental issues, or maybe if, they are also possibly part of the problem. And in fact, this is my first point, is the fact that regional trade agreements have a double or dual effect on climate change, because obviously, regional trade agreements are there to promote trade. And we all know that trade, can have both a positive or negative impact, it depends. And but in Asia, we have noticed that basically through trade, through enhanced production, FDI, and economic development, we have also observed that it has been driving the growth in CO2 emissions. Now, at the same time, trade agreements can also be a channel by which countries can reduce their greenhouse emissions through different channels. So one would be environmental provisions, the second would be trade facilitation. You can also facilitate market access for environmental goods and also services. And finally, it can promote regulatory cooperation. And I would also like to emphasize that even if regional trade or regional trade agreements can be perceived as detrimental in the short run, because we promote trade and obviously it will increase economic production and possibly emissions, then it can also lead to higher income in the long run that could also help developing economies, and particularly the poorest one, to maybe in the future develop greener industries and invest in new technologies. And because at the moment they may not have the capacity to do that. So RTAs at global level have been recognizing the importance of environmental sustainability, as you can see on the screen. That we have an average number of environmental provisions increasing dramatically over the years, from really low numbers in the 1990s to 87 in 2018, and I'm sure now it's still increasing. However, improvements are really still needed because those provisions are often limited in scope and also in depth, especially in developing economies. Now, while climate change provisions are on the rise, and I just showed in the previous graph, and also here on screen you can see the specific climate change provisions. It's always still useful to have in trade agreements a dedicated chapter on climate change and mitigation policies, because I think it will be more specific and promote more green value chains. And in fact, because those provisions on climate change, the explicit ones, they are usually less detailed than other types of environmental provisions. And of course, you can also argue in trade agreements about other types of provisions, like trade facilitation. Trade facilitation, as you can see on screen, you have a lot of provisions in trade agreements about trade facilitations, especially following the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO. And trade facilitation can have positive impact on climate change issues and on environment, but still it seems the benefits are relatively limited. And that's why we still need this separate chapter. But let me further just develop on trade facilitation, because why shall we say trade facilitation is not a substitute for environmental provisions? Well, simply because, yes, it decreases mostly delays, let's say at the borders, or you will have policy reforms for increased transparency or simplified customs procedures, in border agency cooperation, and all this would lead to lower emissions, because even if you think of all these vehicles at the border, like waiting, so then it's very helpful in that regard. And you have a lot of different studies showing that indeed trade facilitation will reduce greenhouse gas emission. But and the most, I would say, the most impactful trade facilitation provisions that you can have for climate mitigation impact is digital trade facilitation provisions. Because as you can imagine, you go paperless, then you save paper, you limit transportation of physical delivery, you lower the time and transaction costs. So obviously, you have an important impact. And some studies, one study has established that, for example, in Asia, you could have in Asia Pacific up to 23 million tons of CO2 emissions reduced annually if we were to move to paperless trade fully. Well, this is a important number, but if you place it in the context of the total emission in Asia, then this is only 0.14%. So this is why I'm saying trade facilitation is good. It can have a positive impact, but still we need to have make more efforts towards including environmental provisions in regional trade agreements. Now, yes. You have the question, another issue is environmental goods. So I'm gonna go very quick because we don't have much time. So, but another possibility to use regional trade agreements to promote environment, to protect environment, would be to liberalize trade of environmental goods. But obviously there are a lot of challenges, and as mentioned by Excellency Sambuaga in this presentation, something very important is about definitions. So, and this is the same challenge we have in regional trade agreements. How you want to liberalize environmental goods, but how do you define environmental goods in the first place? And this is precisely the main issue, because as you know, you have negotiations at the WTO for environmental goods agreements, but this is also, it has stalled or it's not progressing so as fast as we would like. And you have a definition by also at the regional level by APEC, but this is relatively limited because you have only like 54 goods. And also the commitments are on a voluntary basis. So basically here, the main challenge is to find a way to define those goods in the most appropriate way. And this is very, very challenging. You have either the list-based approach that you can use, for example, HS6 products, because this is the customs classification, so it makes sense for trade. But the problem is you cannot find one HS6 good that is you're sure 100% is an environmental good, because it can be dual use. If you think, I don't know, a tank to store fossil fuel or to store green hydrogen. So you see, it's very difficult. And other approaches followed, for example, by the OECD or Eurostat would be like focusing on processes. But then how do you match this with customs and data and trade is also very challenging. So these are elements that we still need to discuss. Now, in terms of services, I think here we are at a very early stage, but I think it would be important to also discuss about environmental services, because goods is one thing, but even if you think of a solar panel you want to install, you need services provided to explain you where to position and how to, how to install it. So services are also quite important, and I think we need to make more efforts in defining those, and maybe in the services chapters of trade agreements we would think of mentioning this, because so far it's not the case. So finally, I think, the last element is about regulatory cooperation. In general, we know that trade agreements promote regulatory cooperation, and for example, we could think of certification that is really critical in the case of environmental, goods and trade, and even in FDI. And so I believe we could discuss how trade agreements could incorporate more of these elements. But most importantly, I would like to mention that we talk about trade agreements to discuss environment, but there are also other ways, because regional trade agreement is specific on trade. Now we expand more and more on digital, on environment, on different new areas. But this is not the only way, and this is important to keep in mind, because the more we add in one agreement, the more we have negotiating challenges. And I think everybody would agree. So you can think of all different elements like memorandum of understanding, the GSI, or other initiatives. And my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramila. I think it's quite good for you to have or to discuss the elements of regional trade agreements that can help us to to realize a greener international trade, which is also a greener regional or global value chains. But before going on to Samir, I would like to ask you whether if you can also give us insight on the biggest trade agreements that just implemented a while ago, which is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because this economic partnership or trade agreement basically is intended to promote global value chains, especially the regional value chains in East and Southeast Asia. How it also deals with the environmental issues and climate change issues.
Thank you, Jose. Well, first of all, RCEP, yes, is a new agreement, but in the area of environmental protection, it's not really like the most advanced one, I would say, because CPTPP has set high standards in the area of environmental protection. You have Chapter 20 that will promote sustainable development, but in RCEP, and you have also other agreements in the region where you do have environmental chapters, like for example, I don't know, EU Vietnam or the bilateral agreements with the EU. But RCEP doesn't have any chapter on environment or environmental provisions. It only mentions twice, only in the preamble, the word sustainable development, because you recognize that you have the 3 pillars of sustainable development and recognizing that you have interaction between them, meaning social, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainable development is recognized to be connected. But that's the only place in the agreement where we find something related to environments. So somehow it's a bit obviously disappointing from that perspective. And in fact, some empirical studies also show that it may have a negative impact on emissions somehow, obviously by boosting regional trade. Some other studies shows that if this is forward GVC participation, then it can be a positive impact. But if it's backward GVC participation for a country, then it can have a negative impact on emissions. Meaning you increase emissions when a negative impact on climate. So I would say the answer is a bit controversial because somehow more effort is needed to improve the environment in RCEP. But the last thing that I think we rarely mention in these discussions is about the fact that RCEP is a very large agreement, and if it is properly implemented, it can promote regional value chains instead of global value chains. Meaning you might be observing nearshoring. And possibly, if it is well implemented, if countries manage to comply with rules of origin, etc., this can happen. And in this case, maybe you could also think that instead of importing or exporting too far away, having nearshoring could have also a potential positive impact.
Thank you. That's very informative and also insightful. Now I'm going to ask Samir, especially on the issues of the unilateral trade policy. We've been talking about the multilateral efforts and the regional efforts, although basically in East and Southeast Asia, we still have a lot of homework to promote that thing. The global value chain, greener global value chains. But what about the unilateral trade policy to address the climate issues, especially from a trade perspective?
I think Pramila, in some sense, ended her presentation by suggesting that trade negotiation or trade documents may not be the best venue to achieve environment outcomes. And of course, I would argue that we have a specialized UN process for that. And what we seek to do in terms of performance of countries in this sphere of responding to climate change, of plastics, of biodiversity, we have UN processes focusing precisely on these. And it is trying to actually strengthen those processes rather than dilute them by creating a parallel conversation. I think it neither helps trade nor helps environment if you either leave it to a multitude of processes to manage them. I think that is what that's my first point. But you know what I was doing since I was visiting WTO today, I went to their website and I said I went to the page which says who we are. I thought it's important to know the organization you're visiting. So I want you to know who is WTO. So seriously, it's been in coma for a while, so I forgot. It showed some light this last summer, but you can forgive me for forgetting WTO as not being relevant. But it says the overall objective of the WTO is to help its members use trade as a means to raise living standards, create jobs, and improve people's lives. Right? It also goes and says that in the next paragraph, standards of living, full employment, real incomes, expanding trade in goods and services while allowing for the optimum use of resources. That's the self-definition of WTO. And I guess this flows from the original conception of how trade would benefit everyone. It's not that WTO produced this definition. It only captured the higher purpose of global engagement and trade, which was to generally do better together. And therefore, the first test of any unilateral climate policy that is being implemented through trade is, do we do better together? I think that is the first test. And if any test, and if it passes that test, then we can negotiate and we can discuss the undergirdings and the mechanics and nuts and bolts of that. For me, for example, the EU CBAM fails that test, the smell test, that do we do better together? For me, if I am objective, you were mentioning CBAM, since I'm taking that as an example, I can take many others, but let's EU, since we're sitting in Europe, let's not be too kind to them, right? So let's take CBAM. So for me, what the particular agreement does is, it freezes the carbon profile of countries forever. It means that I as a European have consumed all the carbon space available to humankind. And now I will create policies that prevent anyone from using carbon for their own good. That's one analysis of what the CBAM really means. It makes it impossible for countries climbing up the development pathways to have room to grow. In fact, if I was a cynic, I would argue that poverty of 6 billion people is the mitigation strategy of Europe. Because that particular deal prevents, and I'm going to explain, I know I'm being a little provocative, I'm going to explain that. Global poverty is now becoming an acceptable climate mitigation strategy. And I think that is very dangerous. In fact, if you continue to read newspapers, GDP is not important, growth is not important. You know, you're seeing this European discovery of frugal living after burning 50,000 euros every year per capita. And they want the others to live at $2,000 per capita income and less, and yet not bother about growth and aspiration. So I think unilateral trade policies are now instruments to perpetuate difference, to freeze socioeconomic profiles, and to, in many ways, make permanent the pecking order of economic welfare and well-being and economic power itself. So it is a political tool. For me, trade is not an economic policy the way it is being promoted. It is a geopolitical, muscular proposition that seeks to shape the world in a particular way. And that is one way of examining CBAM. And I can do that for many policies, but I'm just taking CBAM. Now, for example, if CBAM was not intending to be exactly what I'm saying it is, then I would see a provision in CBAM, in the European Border Adjustment Mechanism, which would say that if I collect $500 billion of taxes at the border in the next 5 years through this mechanism, all of it will go to the developing world to green their systems. They are not saying that. They tax the developing world and then they use it for improving the life of their own people. But if it was meant to be a tool to save the planet and to do better together, the definition that I just read from who we are, remember, I just read something. If it was meant to be a tool to improve everyone's lives, then they would say that the tax collected on the border would be redeployed for greening all supply chains, for green cement, green steel, green infrastructure, for shoring up the seashores of Maldives and small island countries. for investing in the front line of climate response, which is Africa and South Asia and India and others, right? We don't hear that. We say that we will distribute it to Poland and to France and to Britain, and Britain will need it very soon. I think so. They will have to have a non-EU partnership with Britain now, because they are going to need some money soon. But no, I'm just kidding. But so that's one point that I want to make. So unipolar policies, unilateral policies are dangerous because they fail the basic premise of what trade agreements are meant to be. And therefore, we had moved to the idea of having multilateral, regional, and plurilateral groups that would discuss trade. I think the WTO has underperformed, and it is fair to expect that countries want to do some things on their own. I think that's a fair expectation. But I would suppose that if in the days ahead, and I think this is the point Minister made in his intervention, if in the days ahead we truly want to create economic engagement that is climate friendly, we have to look at two words together: trade and investment. Because without investment, this is perverse. Trade is perverse. You are freezing global poverty, well-being, welfare, growth, etc., etc. With investment, we can have common prosperity. We can actually create a framework that all of us do well together. So CBAM, if it is going to have an instrument of investment, becomes a very powerful forward-looking tool. But CBAM, where I'm collecting revenues to benefit myself alone, becomes perverse and harmful. And let me close by giving you just some figures and why I'm saying there's an opportunity here and why G20 has a role to play, for example. Can we, over the next 3-4 years of developing country leadership of the G20, can we actually catalyze the largest war chest of climate finance that can be deployed to the least developing countries, the small island nations, the emerging economies? Can we put that together? Let me give you a number. So the IMF estimates that we roughly require up to $6 trillion every year until 2050 if we have to meet our mitigation and adaptation targets, right? This is the IMF report which estimates $6 trillion. Now, how much do you think we raise in climate finance today? We raise 10% of it, $600 billion. Now, if you are only spending 10% of what you need to spend on green infrastructure, green energy, green supply chains, how can you impose trade rules when your infrastructure is underprepared? It doesn't make sense. Your trade policy has to follow your investment profiles. So there has to be a gradation on how you impose certain environmental rules in trade, and they have to be in step with how much money you are putting into making the world ready for these policies. You can't have 10% of financial goals being delivered and 100% of environmental standards being enforced. So I think there has to be a degree of this. Now, this is 600 billion, but guess what? Out of the 600 billion that I'm talking about, only 2% goes to the small island countries. Only 20% goes to the 57 fragile states. The rest of it is all middle income and rich countries raising climate finance and investing in themselves. It doesn't help anyone else. So if you were to be truly honest, the export of capital, 75% of climate finance remains at home. So you want global value chains, but local finance. And it doesn't work. Unless finance also invests, green finance also invests along the route of trade, you are not going to have green value chains. Sorry, I'm not a trade person. As you can see, I'm more of a political scientist. But I think it's important to infuse different views. It's important to infuse certain different thoughts when we are sitting in an environment like this, that unless money follows the trade route and invests along that the path of flow of goods and services, you will not see a green outcome. You will only see geopolitical propositions that benefit one or two or three or a club of actors and not everyone. So I would end by saying that we have an opportunity of unleashing and unlocking the largest savings humankind has ever known. We are sitting on savings of trillions of dollars. We have to be smart, we have to be less lazy, and we have to ensure that these savings flow along the spice routes and the silk routes and the new silk routes and the new digital routes and every new route that we know of. The money must flow and green them as we trade.
Thank you, Samir, for provocative statements. I don't know, but Jerry, you want to say some things I would like to invite Pak Jerry, Peter, and Pramila also to give some kind of comments on that. But maybe we keep it a bit short because we would also like to have our audience to ask questions or comments.
Maybe just a short statement. I would agree with Pak Samir, also rest of us, that first of all, definition. We need to understand the definition and how it is defined and how it is measured. And second, if you take a look at this developed countries, I think Pak Samir would agree with me that they are trying to have these multinational corporations everywhere in the world, investing, doing business, and yet they are complaining. And then they're installing these multinational corporations in countries that have lenient policies on environment, on green environment. But at the same time, they're complaining and they are forcing these developing countries to change the policies. So I would say it's very contradictory, the second one. And then the third one, if we take a look at using Indonesia as an example, we have this dispute settlement with the European Union on the S592 on nickel. Right? We are trying to, let's say, adapt our policy so that we can have a better environment by creating smelter of nickel in Indonesia. But at the same time, European Union forces us to export the raw materials, which is one of, let's say, I don't know, interesting ways of showing that, okay, we are promoting green environment. I think it's quite not only contradictory, but it's quite, let's say, it's quite not interesting. So these are the three examples that I would like to show. But actually, again, collective measures, collaboration, and then of course with the G20 presidency that we're holding, Indonesia being the presidency of G20, India will be next year. I think it is very important for all of us raising the voices of fairness and an equal distribution, and then collective definition of how green environment should be measured, should be distributed, and should be organized. I think it's fair to say that we can deliver this message through this forum and many kind of forum. Thank you.
Peter, do you have something to say?
Just briefly on the CBAM, because Samir gave a very impassioned input on
No, I could have said it about any agreement.
Sure. But it is a very hot topic, so to speak. And also because we did some work on this, and we took our report to Brussels and we presented it in Brussels to DG Trade and other constituencies. And then we took it across to Paris and presented it at the OECD. So a couple of things on CBAM. So one has to remember the impulse behind the design of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is to address what a widely recognized problem, which is carbon leakage. So in essence, what the Europeans have done is they're in the process of imposing domestic carbon taxes on the 64 sectors, so prices are going up. The challenge, of course, is that induces industries in these emissions-intensive industries to relocate production to India or China or wherever. So there's regulation intensive, shall we say, jurisdictions, and then export back to the EU. So firstly, you haven't solved the global problem. It remains the same or potentially gets worse because these are supposedly relatively less well-regulated jurisdictions. But you've also put potentially EU business out of business because you imposed a carbon tax and you made them uncompetitive. So that's the impulse behind carbon tax. That is why other developed countries, and not only developed countries, are also looking at instituting their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So this is actually, it's a global commons problem, and the EU has decided on a unilateral basis to address it based on its own set of values and understandings of what needs to be done. That's the impulse behind it. Now, is the design perfect? Absolutely not. So that's the paper we took to Brussels. Lots of problems with the design. I think the biggest problem, first of all, is it doesn't specifically recognize common but differentiated responsibilities or special and differential treatment. And also with the revenue, as Samir pointed out, it takes the revenue and distributes to Poland, which, by the way, if you just look at Poland and abstract it from the EU context, is just as polluting as Australia, for instance, on coal production. So, but the EU treats the EU as the EU. It doesn't single out Poland. So there's a broader problem within that. So a range of design problems. But at the end of the day, what this unilateral instrument is doing, regardless of its design problems, and I think there are many, is it's forcing the pace of regulation. The rest of us must keep up. And at the end of the day, we have to remember we have a climate emergency, right? That's what it's trying to address. But we need to move at different paces. And that's what's missing, I think, from the EU CBAM design.
Pramila, you want to say?
I would just say I couldn't agree more with the last remark. I think this is exactly the same question that you was facing in regional trade agreements, because basically that's mainly one reason why you will not see environmental provision in our SAPs, because countries have different level of development in our SAP. So you have really important negotiating challenges, even in digital economy or different areas. So obviously in environment, it's extremely complicated to deal with this. And you do have some special and differential treatment is very key. You have some provisions to help, least developed countries, or let's say, least advanced economies to maybe implement the commitments with grace period or like time. But still, obviously, I think this is an important challenge in regional trade agreements. And on the comments that there are other avenues and might not be the best, I think it's indeed correct that I would say we need more streamlining of all this global climate action, because there are, as we discussed, many different processes. Of course, regional agreements, regional trade agreements is different because really is more regional, it's not global, but there are also other ways, and I totally agree that sometimes when we mix too many different topics together, it's particularly challenging to find a consensus. So it's not so surprising that we don't have this function in our.
Just one quick point, something that Peter said triggered that. I don't deny that it's an important piece of regulation that can move the needle. I think that there is another important piece of regulation that should perhaps attract the EU's attention as much, and that is to change the rules for its pension funds to be able to deploy that lazy capital to overseas infrastructure development and green energy plants in Africa, in Asia. But I think Europe is more convinced about squeezing those countries rather than enabling them. So I think there's no denying regulation is required, but there are more than one regulation that needs to be fixed. And I don't think there is any justification for moving the trade agenda faster than the investment agenda. And $100 billion are still 30 billion short, and $100 billion are a joke, right? And even there you are underperforming in terms of your climate commitment. So I see absolutely no reason that any of these two regulations need to be privileged. I think green is as important as trade, and therefore both of them must move together. Green investments and green trade. They are two sides of the same coin. We cannot have green trade without green investments, and that is what is being tried to do. That is my point.
Okay, I would like to open the floor if there is questions or comment. Yep.
Thank you, Yose, and thank you to your panelists for your informative and very comprehensive presentation. Just a quick question to Dr. Peter. You're mentioning about the environmental issues discussion happening here in the WTO, and of course the trade and environmental under the TESSD and the CTE. And of course, our discussion this afternoon is that we see the raising of the unilateral measures and in the name of the environment, right? And you and Dr. Samir mentioned about this event. Just a quick question: how do you see this trend of unilateral measures in the future will impact developing countries in pursuing their economic development? especially as part of the global supply chain and in their effort to climbing up the value chains? That's my first question. And then the second one is that what is the best approach to seek balance between the issues of environment and trade for development? Thank you.
Any other questions? I would like to collect all first before we let the panelists to respond. Anybody? No. We are actually already have a good discussion, a very provocative discussion. All right, then I will ask Peter to respond.
Thanks for the question. I think the short answer, as we've heard, is they already are affecting developing countries in a range of different ways. So we've spoken about the CBAM, that's one particular set of measures. One could talk about palm oil, I guess. Our Indonesian person could understand that issue very well. I think what lies behind that again, and it's important to understand this, is a different values framework. Right? So my interpretation of what's going on in Europe, in part, so it's Europe that's put some restrictions on palm oil or forestry imports and so on, is that it comes out of what domestic consumers and what their voters want. So it's not necessarily, politicians just cooking this up or people sitting in DG trade trying to be difficult to Indonesia or trying to frustrate Indonesia's development. This is what the citizens are telling them and they're voting for it. So that's why more and more Greens are getting elected to the EU Parliament and elsewhere. So we just have to recognize that it is what it is. And what it means for developing countries that want to export into the EU or the US or other big developed country markets is you're just going to have to meet the standards. Now that has a value chain implication. By the way, so meeting the standard, there's two sides to this. One is there's potentially a lockout effect. If you cannot meet the standard, you're locked out of the market. That's a problem, clearly, for developing countries. But they're probably not going to allow your imports in or your exports in if you don't meet the standard. If you do meet the standard, it's potentially a lock-in effect. Right? So now you've got access to the market, which is a good thing. Others don't, they're locked out. So that's good for you and for your exports. But at the end of the day, most of this will be mediated through multinational companies and through their decisions. And we've just been speaking about formal regulations, right? So what the European institutions are coming up with vis-a-vis forestry, for instance, palm oil or CBAMs. But there's a world of private standards out there that not just multinational corporations, but also trade unions, consumer groups, NGOs are coming up with. And these private standards are proliferating. And very often it's those private standards that determine the trade flows. Now, what's the role of the G20 in all of this? Very interesting question, I would suggest. One could be task organizations like the International Standards Organization to take a much closer look at this world of private sustainability standards. But at the end of the day, it's private capital that's voting on this.
Yes, interesting you mentioned about that private standards. I did a study into 2017 about these private standards and the effect to the Indonesian companies, actually, especially in their participations in the global value chains. It turns out that they are the one, those who cannot fulfill the requirements, this private standard, they actually just shift up their value chain and their trade to other countries that don't really have a strict regulations on environment. So that kind of things perhaps also can happen if the kind of standards and regulatory measures implemented at the government level. If there is any other questions or comments, please. If you don't have, I would like to ask each panelist to give a short concluding remarks. First from you, Samir.
No, I think the opportunities are immense and time is running short. And I think rather than being cynical or being skeptical about intentions of everyone, I think we need to put more money on the table. We need to put more political leadership on the table, and we need to bring the whole of society approach to responding to it. I think there is one missing actor. We've all signed the Paris Agreement. It's time big money signs the Paris Agreement as well. Big money has to follow our ambitions in that agreement. Otherwise, forget about global value chains. We will be doing local trade within communities and within countries. It will be very difficult. This is going to be the next big challenge for globalization. You saw how the digital is leading to certain decoupling. Green could lead to the next backlash. Differential speeds are going to create new frictions in global engagement. We should take this seriously. We need to work on this.
Jerry?
Thank you. Yes, I think as mentioned by all the panelists, I think it's interesting to know that we need consensus on how unilateral forum or unilateral actions, they are not the answer. We have more multilateral approaches, multilateral discussions, forums, all kind of multilateral agreements, because we believe in collaboration and connectivity, interdependence, and this as we are coping with a lot of challenges, the global challenges, dealing with green, environmental issues, and so on. And we need to understand also that all trade agreements would be somehow focusing on not only the environment, but all the definition and all the measurements that should be taken. And I'm quite certain that RCEP I think in the future we will be, let's say, we will be discussing about that more intensively. As a matter of fact, I was in Cambodia a couple of weeks ago. We were having this ASEAN economic minister. We also discuss about how greenhouse emission and also carbon trading and also this kind of policy related to the green environment should be underlined, should be taken into a more serious consideration. And we believe RCEP, the RCEP also will play quite strategic roles also in the future. And I think by ratifying the implementation of RCEP, just that we agreed on a couple of weeks ago in Cambodia, I think will make some difference. Any kind of input, of course, welcome. And we are quite certain that it will solve the answer. And last but not least, again, as all of us in this room, that there is where that again, objectivity, definition, they are those two aspects that we must take very serious consideration, because we live again in a very diverse community, not only developed and developing countries, but also a different interests, different policies, and different agendas. And I think it's normal to say that we need to find some common ground here, so that it will be acceptable for all of us, particularly those developing countries, minorities, the one who are oppressed, the one who are, let's say, intimidated for so long, because these groups, they have, I think, better justification to be heard, their voices. And I think it is within all of us interest to convey this message. Thank you.
Peter?
Maybe I'll just bring our conversation back to this house and this forum, which is the WTO. So I'm a multilateralist by instinct, but I think we all know, I think Samir, you described the WTO as comatose up until MC12, but I think that was not an inaccurate description. But at least we now have action. And where you can't get multilateral agreements, fishery subsidies agreements such as it is now took 25 years or so to conclude, and it still hasn't concluded. The difficult work really lies ahead. you do need smaller group processes amongst like-minded countries. I think there's a variety of those emerging now in the WTO context. The WTO will have to look at it, and its members will have to look at it through the trade lens, because that's the function of the WTO. It's the World Trade Organization. All the other multilateral processes will continue. Their task is not necessarily to focus on the trade implication. That has to happen here. There, I think the TESSD process is very important, actually, because it's a deliberative form. These are complex issues. We only just scratched the surface. So I hope they will lead to positive results, but I think it's going to take quite some time. And maybe not everybody is going to be on board.
Pramila.
Thank you very much for speaking the conclusion, talking about regional trade agreements in general and about what has been said also earlier about standards, and that you have the risk to look in or look out some economies. I think in general, any agreement, what we need to focus on, I believe we do not focus enough while even negotiating, is about implementation and capacities in implementing these agreements in general. Because I'm an expert in trade agreements, but more specialized in the traditional trade, trading goods, etc. But when you think that most of the developing economies, they have signed agreements, they are just not even able to implement the simplest part of it, trading goods, because they don't understand how rules of origin are applicable. How could we expect them now suddenly to understand everything, like digital environment, and to meet all the standards? Well, we know that even SPS, normal SPS and TBT standards are difficult to meet. So I would say my advice in general for policymakers and negotiators, that is multilateral, regional, plurilateral, is to try to always think about implementation capacities of the different countries of your economy, but also of the economies you're negotiating with. Because I think without thinking about this, then you take the risk to sign agreements that will either never be implemented or be implemented only by the richest economies that have the capacity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for very interesting insights from the perspective of multilateral, regional, and also the bit on a unilateral policy. Thank you very much also to our participants here. Hopefully you can get useful information from our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.